So welcome everyone. Welcome to today's event, which is part of the 2026 Speaker Series in Critical Zionism Studies, hosted by the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. I'm Heike Schotten, a member of the Institute Collective. I'm joined today by the brilliant Julia Gillich, who is also a member of the ICSZ Collective and the labor that makes everything happen. And they're hiding, but they're under the radar, but they are crucial. So Yulia will be doing the tech, and I will be the host and moderator of today's event. First, what I will do is introduce our speaker, who will talk for approximately 25 minutes, more or less. And at that point, we'll open things up to discussion and questions from the audience. If questions come up for you during the talk and you don't want to wait, or you feel like you can't wait, feel free to put them in the chat, and I will monitor and keep track of them for later. Feel free also to wait until the end and use your voice and ask a question. That's also totally great. I know I'm going to have questions of my own, so there'll be lots of questions. And I think it'll be a good discussion, and we will end in exactly 1 hour. So we will be done, for those of us on the East Coast, we will be done at 2 p.m. Okay, so it is my pleasure, it's my real distinct pleasure to introduce Matt Seriff-Cullick, who is an activist, a professional chef, a published author, and an independent scholar based in Barcelona. I encourage everyone here to read his article, published in the second issue of the Institute's journal, the Journal for the Critical Study of Zionism, entitled How White Folks Became Jews, the War on Black Antisemitism, and the Recalibration of Racial Regimes. I'll post a link to it in the chat once Matt gets started. In that article, Matt offers a close reading of the neoconservative trope and talking point, which is sometimes called, which they called Black anti-Semitism. And he shows in this article among many other things, this trope co-opted the position of racialized victim of oppression for Jewish people via the neoconservatives' purposeful misrepresentation of Black anti-Zionism as a form of anti-white racism. Oh, thanks, Yulia just posted the link. It's a fantastic read. In this talk today, Matt continues and builds on this work, in my opinion, examining the current fissure on the MAGA right over U.S. support for Israel. I think it'll be a really stimulating presentation, and I'm really looking forward to questions and discussion of Matt's thesis, which is a real contribution to what is a very current issue and a seemingly intractable quandary, not only for U.S. political punditry, but also for those of us on the left trying to navigate and figure out just what in the heck anti-Zionism and anti-imperialism are and how they work. I learned a lot from this piece, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Matt's talk is entitled The Far Right's So-Called Civil War Over Israel, Staged Antagonisms as Counterinsurgency in the Fascist Arrangement. So, Matt, take it away.
Matt, you're muted.
Okay, that's important. Sorry about that. Hi. Can you all hear me and see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great.
I can see.
Well, thank you so much, Heike and Julia, and thank you so much to the Institute for the opportunity to share some of what I've been working on and to be in dialogue with everyone who's here today. And also to Alana Lentin, who isn't here, but who helped make the webinar happen. I have learned so much from the Institute, both through the process of collaborating on that piece in the journal and from everything that the Institute does. So I'm just really grateful to be able to collaborate a little bit with y'all and share some of this today. So the thoughts that I'm going to share are taken from a piece that I started to work on late last year in a moment when right-wing critiques of US support for Israel started to surge in visibility, with the Nick Fuentes appearance on Tucker Carlson's show and Norm Finkelstein's appearance on Candace Owens' show. These newly very visible right-wing critiques of Israel, as I'll discuss a little bit more later, have been largely associated with an insurgent, often openly white nationalist segment of the far right, whose critiques of Israel are largely anchored in a self-styled America First isolationism and in anti-Semitic conspiracism. Right away, the conflict between these factions and the more establishment neoconservative and Zionist factions on the right was basically branded as a civil war. You can see all of the headlines here love to talk about the civil war on the right. Others called it an existential crisis. Folks said that it was tearing the right wing apart. In response, a number of folks in the Palestine solidarity movement started to celebrate the turmoil on the right and to celebrate what appears to be a blow to Zionist hegemony. Some were and still are proposing an alliance with what they call right wing anti Zionists, a term that I think is a serious misnomer, for the purpose of ending the current escalation of genocide. There's been articles in Mondoweiss and multiple conversations on the Jewish Currents podcast with folks basically saying that overall this is a positive development, that there's some anti-Semitism mixed in with all this, and that's worrying, but that basically it's a good thing that these people with big platforms are pushing back against US support for Israel and pushing back against mandatory Zionism, even if the reasons happen to be anchored in white Christian nationalism. So, the impetus to write this paper came out of a frustration with this discourse and a real worry that folks are inadvertently playing directly into a strategy of co-optation or capture that's designed to redirect Palestine liberation insurgency into a politics of white nationalism, misogyny, and transphobia. And as I'll explain a little bit later, escalated imperialist aggression, including Zionist aggression. So, this talk traces my attempts to better understand how the strategy of capture is working on the far right, specifically by trying to understand the work that's being done by all of the attention to the civil war, quote unquote, over Israel that's supposedly being waged. I get the sense that this is a development for which we need some new language and some new conceptual frameworks, and in order to stay focused on the simultaneous and intertwined struggles against Zionism, US-led imperialism, and settler colonialism in all its forms. So I hope that these thoughts will be useful to folks in that regard, and I'll look forward to hearing what this brings up for you. So by way of a quick overview of what I'll be discussing today, there's four main points. The first one, I'll start by talking through some of the conflict on the right. I'll argue that while the factions are at odds rhetorically and even ideologically, they're on the same page about a lot more than they let on. From there, I'll talk through some insights from George Jackson that have been particularly helpful for me in understanding how multiple seemingly contradictory factions actually work together, and how that's helped me understand the kind of unique characteristics of this fascist counterinsurgency. From there, I'll address the anti-war and anti-imperialist components of right-wing critique of Israel. I argue that anti-imperialist rhetoric on the right leads to outcomes that actually exacerbate imperialist violence. And I'll propose that we can use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's concept of the anti-state state to better understand what I refer to as anti-imperialist imperialism. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the anti-Semitism on the far right and how it works in tandem with the establishment right's anti-Semitism. All right, so there are two main threads of right-wing anti-Israel critique that I want to start by pulling out, and then I'll give an example of how this plays out to make it a bit more concrete. The first thread is what kind of coalesces under the heading of America First, and it includes positions that are self-described as isolationist, anti-war, or anti-imperialist. My partner helped me practice not doing this constantly during the entire talk because it's distracting, but please know that there's very dramatic air quotes around isolationist, anti-war, and anti-imperialist. Whether or not folks are immersed in this discourse, I think the anti-war framework will be familiar to folks from Trump's electoral campaigns, from which he actively campaigned on a promise to end forever wars and had this whole anti-war self-styled image. Others on the far right are going so far as to co-opt the language of anti-imperialism using a kind of classic fascist strategy of appropriating anti-capitalist terminology to recruit from the left. While these factions present themselves as anti-imperialist, and they sometimes lean on moral or economic arguments against war, their framework for this conviction is largely rooted in white nationalist logics. For example, a common refrain is that overseas wars should be opposed because they drive destabilization elsewhere in the world, which creates refugee crises, which leads to non-white immigration into the West, and that's why we should be anti-war. So the second thread of anti-Israel critique is what we might group together under the heading of the Zog or Zionist-occupied government thesis. This is the argument that Jews and/or Zionists secretly control the government and the world generally as part of a ploy to undermine and destroy Western civilization. As a bit of an example of how this all plays out, here's an overview of what Tucker Carlson has been saying about the reasons behind the current U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. And I'm sorry to make you look at Tucker Carlson's face for a few slides. That's rude. So Carlson has argued that Israel and US Zionists secured US involvement in the war using power that may or may not be supernatural. He said that Trump didn't want to join the war, but had no choice because he was effectively a slave to these greater powers. And Israel's goals, according to Carlson, were not just to attack Iran, but to indirectly undermine the US and the West. He said that Israel knew that the war would trigger devastation in the Gulf region generally. This would turn the Gulf states against the US. The US would be effectively kicked out of the region. And with the US gone, Israeli hegemony would be cemented in West Asia. Simultaneously, the devastation caused by the war would foment a crisis of Muslim immigration into Western Europe. This, according to Carlson, is just one part of what he calls a spiritual war on Christian civilization, which he says, like transgenderism or love of abortion for its own sake, is a modern manifestation of human sacrifice designed to appease the gods and get power for yourself. So, in Carlson's universe, the US has no genuine self-interest in attacking Iran, and the US is a competitor to Israel, not its imperial sponsor. I feel like this narrative really neatly weaves together all the threads that I was talking about above. It follows this classic white nationalist anti-war position. It shows how the anti-war argument and the Zog argument work together within the framework of a great replacement conspiracy. It shows really clearly how the anti-Semitism of the Zog argument plays an important role in weaving together white nationalism, transphobia, and misogyny of Carlson's project more generally. And it washes the US's hands of responsibility by effectively saying the Zionists made me do it, or the Jews made me do it. I do want to note that while Carlson's understanding of Israel's role is quite conspiratorial and might, to some ears, sound kind of out there, and transparently are anchored in a far right politic. You have to dive a little bit below the surface to get a full picture of his perspective on this stuff. A lot of the time, he's stressing much more relatable arguments, like insisting that killing innocent people is immoral and attacking the conflation of anti-Israel critique with anti-Semitism. He even talks explicitly about the IHRA definition as a tool of repression. So those that stay with him can get drawn pretty deep into a far-right universe, but a lot of what he presents to the world right up front are arguments that might well and often do resonate for folks on the left. And it's impactful to see folks, again, with such a big following naming some of these arguments. So you can see why this approach puts Carlson and others like him at odds with the establishment right. On its face, the isolationist and anti-war rhetoric seems like it presents a genuine challenge to the hawkish, neoconservative, and Zionist factions who have held sway for decades now. Simultaneously, the open anti-Semitism of the insurgent far right presents a challenge to the right's investments in anti-Semitism, which has served for decades as a tool for manufacturing consent for the war on terror, for the repression of Palestine liberation movements, and for liberatory movements more generally. So this has led to some really public beef between factions. At the Turning Point USA conference in December, Ben Shapiro, who's pictured here facing off against Tucker Carlson and what is probably like a horrible AI generated image that I didn't generate, but there it is. So Ben Shapiro lashed out at Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, calling them charlatans and frauds and grifters, and calling for ideological border control within the conservative movement. Candace Owens clapped back, saying, "Every time Ben speaks, I feel more certain that Israel is involved in Charlie Kirk's killing." Steve Bannon said Ben Shapiro is like a cancer, and that cancer spreads. Carlson accused Shapiro of propagating Islamophobia. And basically, all the coverage after the event was about this conflict between pro-Israel and anti-Israel factions, and described the MAGA movement as being in the midst of a civil war. And you can sort of imagine how, if nothing else, from a perspective sort of Schadenfreude, it's easy to celebrate this discord on the right and easy to get drawn into that. But what's not being talked about in all this coverage is the really wide swath of agreement between the two factions. Effectively, the neoconservative Zionist factions claim that Israel supports and defends the interests of Western civilization and white supremacy. The insurgent anti-Israel factions claim that Israel undermines the interests of Western civilization and white supremacy. Both agree that U.S. white Western values and interests must be defended. This is fundamentally a strategic difference, not a fundamental antagonism like it's made out to be. And furthermore, the anti-Israel faction is dangerous in a particular way because it projects all responsibility for the U.S.-Israel genocide in Palestine and the ongoing Nakba onto the Zionist entity itself, obfuscating and denying US complicity. This is kind of a key point for me. In attacking Israel, these factions on the far right are washing the hands of US led imperialism. And that's not a side effect. It's not a weakness of their analysis, as some have claimed. I'd argue that it's a key facet of their strategy. I think that the right wing attacks on Israel are in large part a response to the success of the Palestinian resistance and the global Palestine liberation movement, designed to deflect that insurgency away from US led imperialism while evolving but not abandoning US investments in the Zionist project. So I think most folks on this call will understand the point about the centrality of US-led imperialism to the Zionist project and the utility of the Zionist project to US-led imperialism and Western colonialism more broadly. And there's so much more that could be said on this, but I'll just quote Max Eil, who says it quite well. This quote is on the screen for you here. It says that Israel is pound for pound the best investment that the US has ever made. Israel is the purest expression of Western power, combining militarism, imperialism, settler colonialism, counterinsurgency, occupation, racism, instilling ideological defeat, huge profitable war making, and high tech development into a manticore of destruction, death, and mayhem. In other words, the lie that's propagated by the anti Israel right is that US support for Israel goes against US values and interests. Whereas Zionism has always served and reproduced and continues to serve and reproduce the values and interests of white supremacy, empire, and Western civilization. The centrality of Zionism to US-led imperialism, US-led imperialist strategy is deeply entrenched, multifaceted, and overdetermined. And what for me the discourse about a civil war misses is that I think there's every reason to believe that this relationship will withstand an ideological shift in the US if that ideological shift doesn't challenge the fundamental bases of US led imperialism and white supremacy. But furthermore, I think there's pretty clear evidence that the impact of the anti-Israel right, even as its influence grows, in addition will additionally not even fundamentally challenge U.S. investments in Zionism. And so this point came into focus for me earlier this year when Netanyahu announced that he wanted to wean Israel off U.S. military aid over the next 10 years. So this is a sort of what I think of as a kind of a case study for what the material impacts of these political and ideological developments might be. When Netanyahu made his announcement, the Zionist press was really enthusiastic about it. In fact, there's been a long-standing thread on the Israeli right that's called for the end of US aid. The argument goes that the end of US aid will remove supposed constraints on Zionist aggression placed by the US. Actually, I have to pause and do big air quotes. The supposed constraints on Zionist aggression placed by the US, and that the end of aid will also dampen critique from within the US. It'll allow Zionists to sidestep the manufacture of consent that's been delivering diminishing returns. I thought it was quite telling, actually, in the interview where Netanyahu announced his intention to wean the Zionist entity off of aid. He said, I think it's time to assure that Israel is independent. He didn't say, I think it's time to ensure that Israel is independent. I think it's time to assure. In other words, the intention was to signal Israel as an independent actor and not to fundamentally change the dynamic. And then the third point that Zionists make is that ending US aid will represent what Netanyahu calls childhood's end for Israel, signaling an era of self-sufficiency. All of these arguments understand implicitly that the direct military aid that the US provides is far from the most important element of the US Zionist alliance. The crucial elements of that alliance include diplomatic cover, bilateral military projects, security cooperation, the legally instituted guarantee of a qualitative military edge for Israel, and collaboration in wars of aggression, as we're seeing now. All of that can and will continue without direct military aid, but without the supposed pitfalls, the constraints supposedly placed by the US and the anti-Israel dissent within the US that they know will be much quieter when military aid is out of the picture, and which polling supports. Um, so we're seeing this happen in real time, as Michael Plitnick just reported in Mondoweiss just a couple of days ago, in terms of the evolution of the relationship to focus more on security and military cooperation as opposed to direct aid. What the Zionist press understood very clearly is that rather than a retreat from supporting the Zionist project, the end of direct military aid represents a strategic pivot towards unleashing Israeli war making and downplaying hegemony in favor of raw power, while appearing as a concession to diffuse critique. It also helps to establish Israel as a paradigm for Trump's vision of an international order, wherein participation in US led imperialism demands escalated military spending coupled with neoliberal austerity. In this sense, the elimination of aid to Israel fits seamlessly within the context of the recent turn in US imperialism towards an abandonment of any and all pretensions to adherence of to the rules-based liberal international order, alongside a supposed narrowing of focus to the Western Hemisphere, the so-called Donroe Doctrine. I think it's worth noting that Netanyahu's announcement came exactly 1 week after the US kidnapping of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, which epitomized this turn towards what folks have called gangster imperialism. So by ending military aid to Israel, then, the US stands to gain an even more emboldened, belligerent proxy, one who's willing and able to intervene forcefully in West Asia without the US having to dirty its hands as frequently in the region or to bother to manufacture consent. In this sense, the end of US aid to Israel, though impelled in part by right wing critique, represents not a retreat from, but in fact an evolution and a retrenchment of the role that Zionism has long played in Western imperialism, and one that is precisely suited to this current moment. In this sense, the right-wing capture of anti-Israel critique not only threatens to co-opt and redirect anti-Zionist insurgency into a framework that holds up rather than challenges US-led imperialism and white supremacy. In so doing, it also becomes a potentially extremely effective strategy for preserving and escalating, not diminishing, Zionist aggression and US investments in that Zionist aggression. Um, all right, so that's kind of an overview of my sense of how these dynamics might be playing out on the right. And the next sections of the talk, which will be shorter sections, go into a little bit of the theoretical frameworks that have helped me kind of wrap my head around this, and I think provide some additional generative insights. So we've seen how these two factions on the right, which appear to be locked in a fight to the death, excuse me, actually have compatible aims. For one thing, they're in very happy agreement about the end of US aid to Israel. So how can we make sense of what appears to be such an intense antagonism between the two? For me, as I was trying to make sense of this contradiction on the right, George Jackson's writing about fascism was particularly helpful. There's a quote from Blood in My Eye where he says, "The final reason why the importance of ideology in fascism must be denied is the fact that it exists in more than one form. In fact, historically, it is proved to have three different faces. One out of power that tends almost to be revolutionary and subversive, anti-capitalist and anti-socialist. And then he goes on to describe what he calls two different in power faces of fascism, which are repressive or tolerant of dissent to greater or lesser degrees. And he says that the finished product, the actual fascist arrangement, is diametrically opposed to its original ideology. Within this schema, the insurgent anti-Israel factions of the far right represent an out-of-power face to fascism. Their open embrace of anti-Semitism helps them consolidate a dissident political identity by generating confrontation with the establishment right. And their critique of Israel helps draw attention and support to their project from folks across the political spectrum who are understandably revolted at, in this case, the live-streamed genocide of the past 2.5 years. The neoconservative Zionist establishment right, on the other hand, represents Jackson's in-power face. It's the combination of both faces working together that constitutes what Jackson might call the final fascist arrangement. In other words, without the appearance of conflict between the two factions, the out-of-power face wouldn't have its same dissident quality and wouldn't attract the attention that it does, and wouldn't be able to absorb and redirect the energy of the Palestine solidarity movements into a politics of white nationalism. That's why I'm thinking about the staged antagonism between the two factions, the appearance of the conflict itself as a kind of counterinsurgency. And for me, I have historically largely thought about counterinsurgency as having a kind of duality to it. There's this repressive right-wing counterinsurgency that aims to smash dissent, and then there's the seductive liberal counterinsurgency that aims to soothe, co-opt, or preempt any kind of uprising. But through this work, I've started to think about this particular maneuver as a third format of counterinsurgency, a particularly fascist framework of redirection of insurgency into far-right frameworks that are fully compatible with and uphold and evolve racial capitalism and white supremacy. I'd be curious to know if folks have thoughts on this or what this brings up for folks. Um, so if we understand these two right-wing factions as complementary parts of a fascist arrangement, rather than fundamentally antagonistic forces, how should we think about the confrontations over questions of imperialism versus isolation and anti-Semitism versus anti-anti-Semitism? So, with regard to the former, I found it generative to think about the far right's anti imperialist rhetoric through an analogy to what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls the anti state state, the state that grows on the promise of shrinking. Gilmore documents how, over the since the 1980s, I think generally a rhetoric of the state as burden or threat has been deployed by politicians and pundits who, quote from Gilmore, have no intention of shrinking the state. Rather, their intent has been and continues to be to remake the state to do other things. End quote. Specifically, the state has been remade to increase its carcerality, not only by investing in prisons and policing, but by refashioning various state functions to mirror the carcerality of the prison system. Likewise, Trump came to power on an anti-war platform and appeared to fulfill commitments to isolationism by dismantling much of the architecture of US soft power, but has in fact pivoted towards escalated military spending and naked imperialist aggression. So this chart shows in some more detail that I won't totally be able to get into right now, how I'm thinking about the parallels between the anti-state state and the anti-imperialist imperialism on the right. I think Gilmore's formulation is a really helpful one for describing the durability of apparently contradictory political forces and rhetorics, or the apparently contradictory rhetoric and actions, and thereby mystifying somewhat the anti-war and anti-imperialist rhetoric on the far right. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next session rather than going through the whole chart, but I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if folks are interested. So the synergy of anti-Semitism and anti-anti-Semitism. There's a lot to say on this, but for my purposes today, I just want to point to the work of Alana Lentin, another member of the Institute, who points out that anti-Semitism is, quote, always already in service of the European state, and by extension, the West and white supremacy. Linton, so in her book, The New Racial Regime, which came out a year ago yesterday, I think, Linton documents how the medieval European state consolidated itself and thereby began to construct the white Christian Western subject, in part through the dual instrumentalization and expulsion of the Jews. In other words, she shows how anti-Semitism played a role in the formation of pre-modern European racialism that laid the groundwork for racial capitalism. She goes on to show how anti-Semitism, joining with the war on terror, positions the Jew as a kind of proxy for the European subject in need of saving from the racialized, marauding other. In other words, the justification of Islamophobia, war, and genocide, in part on the basis of the supposed defense of the Jew, who is provisionally incorporated into whiteness for these purposes. So both maneuvers, the expulsion of the Jew from the European state to consolidate the white subject, and the internalization of the Jew as a kind of proxy for the white subject in need of defending from the Muslim other, become strategies for what Lenin refers to, quoting other work on this topic, as the primitive accumulation of whiteness. In other words, anti-Semitism and Zionist anti-Semitism are fundamentally part of the same project. And what's important about this to me is that it's really easy to get caught up in celebrating the ways that the anti-Israel right wages attacks on Zionist anti-Semitism It's striking to see someone with as big a platform as Tucker Carlson denouncing the IHRA definition. And it's really easy to get caught up in worrying about or critiquing the far right's increasingly open anti-Semitism. But what's important is to see that what's important is to see these two as part of the same process, as two faces of the fascist arrangement that are pursuing aligned goals. If we can understand anti-Semitic and Zionist anti-Semitic discourse as fundamentally compatible, strategically aligned, and even symbiotic features of a single fascist arrangement, we can tend to the work that's done by the relative centering of one strategy or the other in any given moment, and to the appearance of conflict between the two. So to reiterate, we have two faces of the fascist arrangement, one that leans into anti-Semitic politics, one that leans into anti-Semitic politics. And they're staging this massive antagonism. This is what Ted Cruz called an existential crisis for the Republican Party. And in so doing, they disguise how deeply aligned their aims are. They're effectively dual strategies for white supremacy that use the figure of the Jew in different ways. More to say on that, but I thought I would pause it there. We can get more into that in the Q&A if folks like. So thank you for your time and attention, being willing to stay with me through all that.
Wow. 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 Thanks, Matt. That was a lot. That was a lot. Um, Darren, I don't know what you missed. But let us know if we can supply it for you. Thoughts, questions from people? You will. Sorry. If you got your times mixed up. Are there? I mean, I have a million questions. Do folks have questions that they want to ask? Maybe while you're thinking about and putting your questions in the chat. Or so either raise your hand or put your question in the chat, and maybe we'll give people some time to think out what they want to say and write something down. Matt, I had a question that occurred to me while you were talking. So you were talking about the newfound project on the right to end military aid to Israel, and how this is only going to, in fact, strengthen or constitute a new chapter in the development of the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And I don't know, I got stuck. I got stuck because I have been not in a bad sense indoctrinated. Like I've been taught for the last 20 years, our job as people who live in the US, our job is to stop military aid to Israel. Like that's what we are supposed to do. And so if that is not going to, so what does your reading or analysis or argument suggest for that, what I feel like is just such a central piece of what Palestine Solidarity Movement in the US means or is supposed to do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think ending. I think that with respect to the ending of military aid to Israel, I think they're one step ahead of us at this point. But I think that's, we can certainly go further, a complete arms embargo on Israel. So like demanding the end of all security cooperation between the US and Israel, and then also attacking US-led imperialism in every way. I think there's those two pieces of it. Like we need to, with respect to US and Western support for the Zionist project, it needs to be attacked much more broadly than just the military aid itself, which, as I said, is only one small component of the really robust architecture of collaboration between the two entities, and attack US imperialism. Simultaneously, like I think what's important to me is that those two attacks on Zionism and U.S.-led imperialism need to be intertwined. And I'm not, of course, not the first to say this. That's not an original thought, but like that's that was to me what needed centering in that conversation.
Okay, I'm gonna chew on that, and we have a couple questions in the chat, and then Tom will call on you. So the first question, which is also a question I would like you to talk about. And I know because I've read the paper, is in the paper. Can you talk a little bit about how do we name and identify and talk about this problem, this alleged conflict on the right about anti-Semitism versus anti-Semitism without centering Jews in a discussion about Palestine and Palestinian genocide? And then another question, do you have thoughts? I'm just going to read it. Do you have thoughts on how the Carlson sphere is thinking about the relatively small but significant parts of the Palestine solidarity sphere that are not on the left, but are in some cases Trump voters, anti-Black, etc.? And then that we'll start with those two.
Cool. Yeah. No, thank you so much for those questions. That one, the first one about how do we avoid centering Jews in a conversation about Palestine, I think is so important. As you mentioned, it is addressed um, in the paper, and you and I talked about getting into this in dialogue format in the Q&A because it is important. And I totally agree. I think that it's obviously really tricky territory. Dylan Rodriguez talks about the language of anti-Semitism as not just having been weaponized, but as constituting a theater of lexical warfare. It's like we're waging battle on that terrain. And I think it's absolutely true that Jewish anti-Zionist writings and activism specifically has too often centered the anti-Semitic implications of Zionism and the damage done to Judaism by Zionism as core concerns in their own right. And clearly the
And I want to
importance
throw
of
in,
those.
can I throw in
Please.
also the
Yeah,
damage done specifically to anti-Zionist Jews who are somehow sidelined, ignored, or underappreciated? As if that was
totally.
the thing we must be most concerned about in this moment is the feelings and marginalization of anti-Zionist Jews.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the importance of all those things obviously pales in comparison to Zionism's genocidal violence against Palestinians and others in the region. So, that said, there is this way in which anti-Semitic conspiracism specifically plays a role in this white nationalist ideology, and so uh, it plays a key role. And white nationalist ideology manifests in racist, anti-Black, settler, colonial, misogynistic, anti-trans violence, anti-immigrant, state and non-state violence. So all of these are mixed in with far right white nationalism. Like as I said, anti-Semitism plays a specific role in that narrative, in their like great replacement narratives and in their Zog theses. And when they espouse all of this, it's only the anti-Semitism that draws objections, right? So the folks in the establishment right, object loudly to Nick Fuentes's anti-Semitism and have very little to say about anything else. So that that objection creates this antagonism between the two forces, and I'm interested in the work that's being done by that antagonism itself. So um, it's I think it's important to name that, and I welcome other thoughts on this question as well. I think there's uh, I guess to sum it up, I think there's some importance to continuing to understand and be able to talk about the ways that anti-Semitism is folded in with these narratives whose actual impact is violences that are much more structural and much more violent than the impacts on Jews themselves. So, yeah, I hope that makes sense, and welcome thoughts from you, Heike, or from the folks who asked the question or others.
Well, also what I hear you saying is that in understanding how anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism function in this seeming fissure on the right, there's a way in which you're not actually even talking about anti-Semitism, much less Jews or Jewish people. You're talking about a particular set of strategies or counterinsurgency, lexical warfare, as like to quote Dylan again. And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
the
yeah.
question of Jewish people or hatred of Jewish people is just beside the point, because it's never about that. It's already a ruse, right? It's already a
Yeah,
charade
yeah,
that the right
yeah.
cares about anti-racism more generally, much less anti-Semitism, much less Jewish people, right? So it's just not even the discussion. And so to maybe even to take up that space, even in acknowledging it, already plays into a set of Zionist presuppositions, right?
Yeah, totally, totally. It's definitely a minefield. Like, yes, they're creating all this hullabaloo about anti-Semitism, and we want to talk about it not because we're particularly concerned, although yeah, not because we're particularly concerned about the impact on Jews, but there's no way to talk about it without addressing the anti-Semitism, which is the what they've constructed this stage of antagonism around. Yeah,
And it's like it's already a trap. Like to take the bait of talking about anti-Semitism like gets us into the realm of talking about Jews and Jewish people, which is part of the distraction game, right?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
No,
yeah.
thank you for that.
Okay, and then Amanda's question
Yes, and
about, yeah, do you see it in the chat there? How the Carlson sphere is thinking about the relatively small but significant parts of the Palestine solidarity sphere who are not on the left, but are in some cases Trump voters or anti-Black, etc. And then I think the next
hmm
question is related, which is why is this idea of a civil war on the right like so compelling to those of us on the left? Um,
yeah, yeah.
is it possible to trace the boundary of pragmatism? Interesting.
Coalitions and exclusive element of the right, or can that only lead to fascist redirection of insurgency? Yeah, it's a great
Great
question.
question. Great.
Yeah, yeah, appreciate that. Great question from a great person. Both of these. So yeah, the it's in I mean, I am struggling exactly how to address this question. I feel like um, the way I've been thinking about this is so much about how the Carlson sphere is trying to take segments of the I hesitate to even to take into to a certain extent segments of the Palestine solidarity sphere that don't have a super committed leftist politics, let's say, and steer them into the right, um, and less about how they, yeah, I'm not exactly sure about how to name um, the relationship of this sphere to folks that are firmly grounded in anti-Black racism, who are Trump voters, et cetera. I might need to take a minute to just sort of like formulate if that's okay. And yeah, with respect to the question about like the question of pragmatism, um, you know, I would answer this with humility, and all of this that I'm sharing I submit with humility. There's a lot of folks who are doing more more work on the ground than I am doing and have been, and I respect where folks are coming from with any kind of strategies, but I do think that there's a way in which there's a trick embedded in the idea of a pragmatic coalition that includes the right and the left. And I think the way I've seen it playing out is folks on the left being pulled into the right, and also and also when the right wing approach to this, I think, is really able to generate a strategy that will leave in place not only US-led imperialism, but also Zionism. As I was kind of getting at with respect to this whole question of the of military aid to Israel, um, there's already this far right discourse about how ending military aid to Israel, and not just discourse, but like planning for how this is going to make Israel, more violent, more unconstrained, and my sense is that a strategy that that is based on a kind of a big tent, on a pragmatic, like sort of single issue, narrow focused approach, will really lend itself to outcomes that don't fundamentally challenge settler colonialism in Palestine, much less anywhere else.
I think this might be related to the distinction you make in the paper between a conflict and an antagonism. That
Mm, hmm.
these conflicts are ultimately on the right are ultimately superficial, and they're not allies because there's a more fundamental antagonism at stake that we
Yeah,
shouldn't. I
right,
mean, yeah.
right,
Um,
totally. Totally. Yeah.
I
And
don't know.
I want to reiterate, it's not just a question of like, oh, we can't let the right co-opt this, co-opt this Palestine solidarity insurgency because, giving them more power and attention and platforming will allow, even if it, aids in Palestinian liberation, will have all these negative effects for everybody else. I don't believe that it will aid in Palestinian liberation. Like I'm very skeptical about that
Right,
claim. I'm very skeptical
right.
about claims that that's even what they're interested in, or even if they think they are, if their strategies would ever have anything to contribute in that way.
Okay, so one question in the chat, and then Tom, I'm going to have you state your question aloud. So, question about how does the war in Iran fit in relation to the America First and out of power fascists like Carlson? And then
Mhm.
Tom, why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Right now, you want me to?
Yeah, please.
Okay, let me try to put together what I was just a few thoughts I um, have, and I guess one is that I've always looked at Israel as a conduit to American imperialistic accumulation, and they're the group that has been able to go in, whether under Rios Montt in the '80s in Guatemala or at the end with Somoza. They were integrally involved, in Chile. They were able to go into places that the U.S. has not been able to sustain because of internal politics. Uh,
Yeah.
what's happening um, here? George Black, who was the editor of the New Left Review in the 1980s, called Israel America's Foreign Legion. And I think that's, I always thought that was very apropos. Cutting aid to Israel, military aid to Israel, I've always thought would prevent the U.S. from being able to use Israel for that purpose. It also obviously would weaken Israel tremendously because its weapon systems, besides what it gets from Britain and France and a few other countries, the U.S. is the major player in that. And does that then change the dynamic, both as far as American imperialism and using its foreign legion, but also forcing Israel to the table to deal with the Palestinians because they don't have the oomph of weapons? So that's sort of
Yeah.
the general question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think it's interesting to like look at the parallels between how Zionist right-wing press is talking about the possibilities of what the way the way that Israel might be able to operate as a proxy post aid, to some of those like roles that Israel played during the Cold War in making interventions that were not politically expedient for the U.S. to be able to pursue openly, and it could sort of like rely on Israeli action to do it. To do it covertly, or with U.S. being able to sort of like uh, evade responsibility for it. But yeah, I think there's a distinction for me between the end of military aid and for the Zionists for the end of military aid versus like a total arms embargo and a total divestment from relationship with Israel. The aid itself. Um, there's been polling on this that shows that, the numbers of folks specifically on the right, and the numbers of Republicans, that object to military aid are much higher than those that object to other forms of security cooperation and other forms of investment, et cetera. So I think it's kind of the military aid itself has a particular quality to it, in that it appears to be like coming out of U.S. taxpayers' pockets. That's not necessarily not true of some of the other forms of security collaboration, but they're just much less apparent. So I think there's something that's politically expedient, for the Zionist strategy about ending aid while deepening other forms of collaboration. And I do think that this article in Mondoweiss that came out on Monday or Tuesday, I think is really helpful in showing how this is already being implemented. Um, I hope that is helpful, and answers your question, and maybe the one you were mentioning before, Heike, as well.
Yeah, it suggests we need to update our talking points or our, what we've been, used to become accustomed to thinking is our proper duty and orientation as US members of Palestine Solidarity. Like, we need
Hmm.
to rethink
Hmm.
the ending military aid as a slogan, as a goal, as a demand. It's
Yeah,
because the shape of politics has changed in ways
totally,
that
totally.
you're
Yeah.
drawing our attention to, which is really helpful.
Yeah, yeah, no, thanks for that. Yeah, I think, and Netanyahu's particularly proud to say too, like, oh yeah, we're ending aid. It's childhood's end. We're going to be independent, and it really, um, he's really positioning the Zionist entity as this kind of like golden boy, for US imperialism, doing what Trump is essentially doing voluntarily, what Trump is like demanding and trying to squeeze out of NATO, right? Like implementing neoliberal austerity to like squeeze money into military spending. And yeah, basically, so the aid is expendable to them. Uh, if they can, it's sort of what we might think of as a kind of a non-reformist reform. To
Hmm.
reference Gilmore again, it's like we're going to remove aid and reinvest in other forms of
Hmm.
collaboration that are less easy to target, politically.
I didn't
Um,
know colonizers also had to go through a period of infancy before they were ready for self-rule. That's usually, I mean,
yeah,
that was news to me.
totally,
So
totally.
I'm aware that we have 5 minutes left and we have a bunch of really great questions in the chat. So I'm just going to try to summarize them and you just say like a little bit about them. So one is a question about anti-Semitism
Hmm.
and what we at the Journal for the Critical Study of Zionism have called the anti-Semitism
Hmm.
industrial complex.
Hmm.
Maybe for that question, I think it might be helpful. I always stumble over the term anti-Semitism. Like I always have to, I always have to stop and be like, okay, that's what that. So maybe if you could just talk for a minute about what anti-Semitism is, as you're talking about it. Well, if we can get to the AIC, we'll get to it. If not, that's okay. And
Yeah.
then there's a question about distinguishing between leftists and liberals. In light of
Hmm.
your argument, Matt, is there more of a confluence between liberal Zionists and right-wing critics of Israel?
Yes.
And I think we know the answer to that one. And the last question, which I also like, is I agree with the framing of the anti-Zionist right as a kind of mirror image of the establishment right. But what I'd like to hear a little more about is, thank you, Yulia, for that. What I'd like to hear a little more about is this: are they going to win? Which is to say, will the Tucker anti-Zionist faction actually become hegemonic in right-wing Republican politics? And what are the consequences if it does? Predict the future. Okay,
Yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah, totally. No, it's really good questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, so anti-Semitism, yeah, I think it really is a stumbling block term. I think
A
referring
lot of
to it
people
as the
use it.
anti-Semitic, yeah, yeah, yeah.
A
I
lot of
think
people
you're
use it.
using,
Yeah.
yeah. So referring to the anti-Semitism industrial complex is a lot more, I think, precise and helpful because it turns our attention to not just a rhetoric or an ideology, but like all of the ways that this is, instituted through organizations and institutions. So yes, I think that does map
But
on. I think
when
also,
you
go ahead.
use it, when you use
Hmm.
it, what do you mean by it? What are you indicating by
Hmm.
anti-Semitism?
Yeah, thank you. I think I am thinking, a lot about what, uh, influenced by again Alana Lentin's framework of the war on anti-Semitism, which, is a phrase that she takes from, Anna Esther Eunice. have that name right. But
You do.
talking,
Yep.
okay, cool. Yeah, talking about the ways that a politics of anti-Semitism has been, or excuse me, of combating anti-Semitism has been institutionalized through, for example, Trump's anti-Semitism task force to attack universities, attack the left, attack people of color. So it is like this, you know, what sometimes gets referred to as the weaponization of anti-Semitism, but
Hmm.
which both Linton and Rodriguez would push back on that framework of
As in,
weaponization, but to say the use of anti-Semitism as a tool for attacking people of color on the left, and
as a tool of counterinsurgency.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, totally.
Okay. Okay. That's super
Um,
helpful. Hmm. Liberal
okay,
Zionists and right
liberal
wing
Zionists. Yes, so
anti-Zionists.
much to say about this. Yeah, in the article, I have a whole final section on this. I really think that there's a lot of ways. I'll just do one quick example, but I do think there's a lot of ways in which liberal responses to genocide have specifically not just like they have a lot in common with right wing anti-Israel critique, and that liberal responses to Zionism to genocide have really teed up this moment on the far right. One way is through the Israel lobby thesis. So the disproportionate
Mm,
emphasis on the power of the Israel lobby effectively does the same thing that this Zionist occupied government thesis do. They're not the same thing by any means, but both of them are a way of washing the hands of US led imperialism. And I should
bravo. Can
probably
I?
leave it there. Yeah,
Well, I'll just jump in and add for those of you
please.
who that Aked wrote a really fabulous book called Friends of Israel, which is more focused on the UK and the ways in which the UK has repressed the BDS movement. But they start off their book right away saying exactly this: like, I reject the foreign agent
Mm,
argument because it ignores and displaces and erases the role of British imperialism. And
mhm.
it's the essentialness of British imperialism to the Zionist colonization of Palestine. So like we're not
Yeah.
having any truck with that argument. So yeah, you're a good company. Okay, and last, who's going to win? Predict the future. Go.
Oh gosh, no, it's interesting. I don't know, but I think it's well, I don't know. I mean, I think rumblings about Tucker Carlson running for president. It does seem like the war on Iran is
No.
very unpopular. It's seems like it very well could um yeah, I think the only thing I have to say about this, which is not predicting the future, is just it would be interesting to see, interesting in a terrible way, to see what happens when this sort of out of power faction gains power. But there's a real spectrum within this out of power faction. Like Tucker Carlson is a kind of folks have referred to him as a kind of he's a figure that's stays right on the edge of the Overton window in a way and pushes it to the right, and there's a lot of folks to his right. So like there's a lot of ways in which I think this could get worse. So that seems like a
Hmm.
maybe a nice thing to leave us all with. Um,
Indeed. Matt, thank you so much. This was really, really invigorating. And yeah, just it's really helpful to have a space to talk about these ideas and appreciate your really careful thinking through of them and walking us through this. And yeah, I haven't seen commentary like this anywhere on what's going on with the right. And I found it really helpful. So yeah,
thank
thank you
you.
so much. And thanks
No,
everybody for
thank
coming.
you.
Check out the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. Join us. We have lots of stuff going on. We'd love to see you, work more with you. And yeah, Masalama. Thank you very much. Yalla.
Thank you so much, everybody.